Welcome to Tech and Travel. Today we have with us the newly launched M1 Macbook Pro. Let's get straight into it. Here are the 5 performance highlights, 2 key issues with the M1 Macbook Pro, and eventually our verdict on if you should buy it. Starting off with the performance of the newly launched M1 chip. This is a 8-core CPU with 4 high performance cores and 4 high efficiency cores, bringing you the best of 2 worlds. On one side high performance and on the other side good battery life. There are 16 billion transistors in this, extremely power efficient. Let's get into the numbers behind this. The M1 MacBook Pro has a single core score of 1725. It is about 50% more than the previous generation of MacBook Pro, and that to the upper end of it, the Intel i9 chip. Compared to the base i5 chip, this is literally miles ahead, more than 2x the speed. In case if you're upgrading your MacBook Pro from 2015, you will feel a big bump in performance. 792 versus 1725. The multi-core scores are even more staggering. The M1 chip delivers a multi-core score of 7518, which is more than the previous generation Intel i9, the highest end. If you're upgrading from 2015, you'll find a 4x bump in performance. Next, let's look at the RAM. The M1 chip is an integrated chip, which means it has an inbuilt CPU, RAM, GPU, and neural engine all part of the same chip. This integrated chip is not just faster, it is more efficient when it comes to power consumption and much more efficient when it comes to RAM utilization. The 8GB integrated M1 chip is delivering the same performance as a 16GB and the 16 as 32GB previously. Next, let's move to battery life. The battery life has improved 2x. It delivers strong 20 hours of performance. In our test, it could last the entire day without any issue. Moving to the display, it is the same Retina display as in the previous generation. Good bright display with 500 nits of brightness, high contrast ratio. To summarize, there is no major change to the display from the previous generation, and it does remain a good solid display. At number 5, the Touch Bar and the Touch ID. Same as the previous generation, the MacBook Pro has a Touch ID, which is useful to make it more secure, and it has a touch bar. Now, in our test, we found the touch bar to be fairly useful. It customizes to different apps, ranging from Zoom to PowerPoint to just about anything else. And yes, there are differences in opinion when it comes to the touch bar, but as far as we are concerned, we find this touch bar to be extremely useful. Now, those are the 5 main highlights. Coming to the key issues, the Facetime camera is a bit of a disappointment here. For a premium laptop, for the Pro model, it ought to have been a 1080p, but instead Apple has chosen to keep to 720p. And finally, coming to the ports, yes, the good news is that we still do have the headphone jack, but overall this MacBook Pro only has 2 ports, just as the previous version. Yeah, Apple possibly could have provided 3 or 4 ports here. Real estate is not such a big issue on this laptop, and it would have certainly benefited the Pro users. Now, coming to the configuration, you can add $200 and go for the 16GB unified memory, but honestly, in our opinion, that is a lot of memory. 8GB is sufficient for most people. Storage, yes, you can add all the way up to 2 terabytes. Before we conclude on the M1 MacBook Pro, it's worthwhile having a look at MacBook Air 13-inch. It is $300 cheaper, and it literally has almost the same chip, delivering very similar performance. In summary, Pro and Air are very close, and all of them perform better than most iMac models. So overall, the 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro is a giant leap forward. Having said that, we have 3 key recommendations for you. At number 1, for most users, MacBook Air is sufficient. MacBook Air with M1 chip is a powerhouse. It is more powerful than most Pro computers in the market, and it is good enough to do 4K editing. Next, 8GB is a lot of RAM with the M1 chip. It performs as well as the 16GB in the previous version, and therefore 16GB option is really not required for most users. And lastly, if you are a Pro user, someone who would be using a Mac Pro, then probably it's worthwhile to wait for the next generation of MacBook Pro 16-inch with the M1 model. it is likely to have a higher performing M1X chip, and at least it would then be worth spending more money on it as opposed to MacBook Air. For more such unbiased reviews and for the latest on tech and travel, subscribe to our channel Tech and Travel.